And today we have with us Dr. Michael Behe, who's professor of biochemistry at Lehigh University and is the author of Darwin's Black Box and the Edge of Evolution, and is the subject of a new documentary called Revolutionary. And one thing about the new film Revolutionary, one of the things it argues, Mike, is that Darwinian evolution has been shown to do really some pretty interesting things, but it's the key innovations, the ones researchers have been able to demonstrate, all seem to be cases where something is getting broken. And I want you to quickly review a couple of your favorite examples, and I say quickly because we want to leave time for another thing I heard you discuss for the first time at the revolutionary screening here in Texas, that of polar bears. Yeah. But first, let's start small, and bacteria and antibiotic resistance. Give us the elevator pitch explanation here.
Well, in many cases, bacteria develop antibiotic resistance by Darwinian evolution, and that's important, medically important, and so on. And it's been used as a paradigm for Darwinian evolution. People get laughed at when they say they are skeptical of Darwinism. People say that, well, you don't believe in modern medicine. But it turns out that in many cases, the antibiotic resistance develops through the loss of some activity that the bacterium previously had. For example, if an antibiotic is made which will enter into a bacterial cell and mess up a particular molecular machine by sticking to it and gumming up the works, one way that a bacterium can stop it is by deleting or breaking that machine and throwing it away. And oftentimes the antibiotic won't have any effect anymore. Well, let me switch over to a different system that I've spoken about before, which kind of gets this point across and does it for an organism that we're much more interested in, and that's people. Humans have developed a number of mutations for malaria resistance. Malaria, is a disease that kills 1 million people a year, mostly in Africa, India, and tropical regions. And malaria resistance was pointed to as a stellar example of Darwinian evolution for decades in textbooks. And the most famous example of it is the sickle cell gene, which can lead to sickle cell anemia. Most people have heard about that, but there's a handful of other genes which have mutated and give their bearers some resistance to malaria. Let me just name a couple of them. One is something called alpha thalassemia, in which the gene for part of hemoglobin is broken and thrown away. And for some reason, that leads to resistance to malaria. Also, it leads to anemia, but the anemia isn't as bad as the malaria, but so it's kind of a desperate measure taken to survive in a very hostile climate. And another mutation is beta thalassemia, where a different gene that forms part of hemoglobin is thrown away. And another one is something called glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase deficiency, where the gene for that material, glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase, which can be abbreviated G6PD, is broken and thrown away. And all of these things help resist malaria. So it turns out that you can have a beneficial mutation, one that will be selected by natural selection in a classical Darwinian process. But the mutation breaks something that was already there. It doesn't build anything. It's tearing down what pre-existed. And it turns out that the more and more science knows, and techniques have been developed in the past decade or two which allow us to track down mutations that couldn't be tracked down before, the more widely spread we see this degradation phenomenon.
So it seems then when organisms find themselves in a unique and I should say, maybe even challenging environment, sometimes selection is able to essentially break something that allows the organism, whether it's a bacterium in the presence of antibiotics or humans in the presence of malaria, that in the presence of those challenges, the organism can survive and at least carry on But since something was broken, if you take the challenge away, you take the antibiotic away, you take malaria away, well, the organism isn't any better off. It's probably in worse shape than it was before.
That's true, but it can adapt to a particular environment, a hostile environment. Some of the listeners might be wondering how breaking something can help. So let me give just a little analogy that I find that it helps people to see. And one is this. Suppose your life depended on your car getting a little bit better gas mileage. What could you do to your car to improve its gas mileage? Well, one thing you could do really quickly is, say, tear off the doors and throw them away, or tear off the trunk lid and throw it away, and decrease the weight, and maybe that would give you a little bit better gas mileage. Of course, you don't have the doors in the trunk lid anymore, and they're useful sometimes. But if you were in circumstances where you didn't really absolutely need them and your life depended on the better gas mileage, then away they go. And this is what Darwinian evolution does. Anything that'll help in desperate circumstances will be thrown away without a look backward if it helps the organism survive a little bit better.
Well, let's go back now to what we talked about initially, and that is polar bears.